Hey, what's going on, y'all? Welcome back. You are joining me today for part two of the real history of slavery. Today, we will be discussing, continuing to discuss how the West contributed to the decimation of slavery worldwide. Again, we address things from the narrative of legit history, a history that you may not be aware of. So, with that being said, we will be jumping right in right now.
There was no Ottoman cruiser in the Red Sea capable of giving effect to this order, and Turkish officials were too frightened to enforce it. Although the slave trade was formally abolished in the Ottoman Empire, under pressure from the British government, slavery itself continued. As of 1891, the imperial palace purchased 11 slave girls for its harem, as others in the Ottoman Empire purchased women as concubines, typically white women from a region near the Caucasus and the Black Sea, known as Circassia, even though every nation in the Western world had by then outlawed slavery. Not only the Turks accepted such slavery, so did the Circassians. Mothers often groomed their daughters for this role and sold them into what was considered to be a desirable situation, at least by comparison with what was available in Circassia. British Foreign Secretary Palmerston said, "The only complaint we have ever heard from the Circassians has been against our attempts to stop the traffic." Contrary to the myths to live by, created by Alex Haley and others, Africans were by no means the innocents portrayed in Roots, baffled as to why white men were coming in and taking their people away in chains. On the contrary, the region of West Africa from which Kunta Kinte supposedly came was one of the great slave trading regions of the continent, before, during, and after the white man arrived.
Did y'all hear that? I think I might back up on that one. Let that play again so we can hear what he said one more time.
From which Kunta Kinte supposedly came was one of the great slave trading regions of the continent, before, during, and after the white man arrived.
Again, this whole idea of the white man being the ultimate purveyors or motivators or even the formulators, the creators of slavery, is completely off. Excuse me, is completely off. As I said in the first video, slavery has been around since the history of man, pretty much, because ultimately evil lies in the heart of every man. So we need to understand the true history so that we can understand where our arguments need to be placed, so we don't have misplaced or displaced anger. Make sense?
It was Africans who enslaved their fellow Africans, selling some of these slaves to Europeans or to Arabs and keeping others for themselves. Even at the peak of the Atlantic slave trade, Africans retained more slaves for themselves than they sent to the Western Hemisphere.
Quick question. Have you, with the exception of those of y'all who are familiar with this work, when have you ever heard this? That the fact that Africans kept for themselves more slaves than those that were sent to the Western Hemisphere. I've listened to this work before on multiple occasions, and I try to revisit it every now and then just to try to keep myself fresh and abreast on the real, true, legit history. But every time I hear it, I hear something new, and it just shocks me. And you just think, like, you go through all these years of school, all these years of being educated, and yet a lot of this information is brand new. It's really wild. And I think that's unfortunate because it demonstrates, especially nowadays, it demonstrates that there is a culture that wants to keep us angry and keep us divided. And they've been very effective in the process.
This pattern was not confined to West Africa, from which most slaves were sent to the Western Hemisphere. In East Africa, the Maasai were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere.
Oh, let me just throw this in here as well, because one argument that I've heard from people who want to defend the slave trade, the African slave trade, saying that they were basically treated well. They were treated like family members. He said that there were feared slave traders. He speaks about how they destroyed crops and famine was all over. You don't do that. If you're treating your slaves well, that's not something that you do. The two just don't jive. Just wanted to throw that in there.
Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Africa to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million.
Wow. Wow.
Despite the impression created by Roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself.
Yeah, a lot of those movies portrayed it as they showed the white man running through the jungle, chasing after Africans, throwing nets over them and capturing them and dragging them off. But in all reality, that was not even remotely the case. Not even a little bit. Blacks, Africans sold other Africans into slavery. But yet, in this whole argument, there is almost never, I've never heard, the only people I've heard that brought up were people who were against the idea of reparations, who said, well, how do we break this down? And how does Africa play a role, considering that they were the ones who sold the slaves in the first place? It would only make sense to me if you're trying to be consistent, if you want to be fair. And so no one has ever brought up, I've never heard anyone legitimately address the issue of Africans, the African slave trade, as far as who were the original slave sellers. I don't think I've ever heard that. Real quick, I have a comment over here from one of the listeners. Thanks for jumping in, James. They don't want people to know. So the powers that be can push the divide. Absolutely. That's just what we're seeing right now. And if we're divided, we can't fight the corruption. My man is spot on. A divided nation, a nation that hates each other, cannot mount up and defend itself against all of the foolishness that's happening in our country. This push for radical Marxist socialistic policies. When we're fighting each other, fighting a history far gone, long gone, we can never really pay attention to what's going on, especially in the Black community. When every time a politician comes to us, they always want to frame the other side as being the enemy, as being racist. Always want to do that. So when you assume that naturally going in, you'll be closed off anytime the other side even speaks. You won't want to hear what they have to say. You won't listen to them. You'll just repeat the same old talking points with a closed mind. It's very unfortunate. But as I say often, it is done because it has proven to be effective for the last 60 years or so. So why not keep it going? They know full well what they're doing.
The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves.
And just real quick, in case someone tries to spin what I'm saying, in no way am I trying to minimize the evils of the slave trade. But I think the blame has often been misplaced. Yes, Europeans, Americans, people in the West overall did some atrocious things. Slavery was evil. But my point that I want to emphasize is it just wasn't the West. It just wasn't the Europeans. It just wasn't the white man. If we're to be fair and to be logically consistent, our anger, if we are seeking to be upset at something that took place decades, centuries gone by, then we need to do it and make sure that we are targeting the right people. And I think it's smart to if that's the path we're going to go down, then the people who initiated the process should also be a part of the disdain, not get a pass. They shouldn't get a pass.
It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans, who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia. In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors. And the Nyoro and Hima of Untold enslaved Toro women and children. The Tutsi dominated the Hutu in Rwanda, the Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba, and the latter, in turn, held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom.
Just a heads up, if you're unfamiliar with the content here, the primary source of information of this book that I know of, because I have a copy of the book, is Thomas Sowells, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. If you're unfamiliar with the book, do yourself a favor and pick up a copy of that book. It is a wealth of knowledge, and it can literally be life-changing. So go out and get yourself a copy.
It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was, with some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children. Historian David Breon Davis pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before. Slavery was destroyed within the United States at staggering costs in blood and treasure, but the struggle was over within a few ghastly years of warfare. Nevertheless, the Civil War was the bloodiest war ever fought in the Western Hemisphere, and more Americans were killed in that war than in any other war in the country's history. But this was a highly atypical, indeed unique, way to end slavery. In most of the rest of the world, unremitting efforts to destroy the institution of slavery went on for more than a century, on 1,000 shifting fronts, and in the face of determined and ingenious efforts to continue the trade in human beings. Within the British Empire, the abolition of slavery was accompanied by the payment of compensation to slave owners for what was legally the confiscation of their property. This cost the British government £20 million, a huge sum in the 19th century, about 5% of the nation's annual output. A similar plan to have the federal government of the United States buy up the slaves and then set them free was proposed in Congress, but was never implemented. The costs of emancipating the millions of slaves in the United States would have been more than half the annual national output, but still less than the economic costs of the Civil War. quite aside from the cost in blood and lives, and a legacy of lasting bitterness in the South, growing out of its defeat and the widespread destruction it suffered during that conflict. While the British could simply abolish slavery in their Western Hemisphere colonies, they faced a more daunting and longer-lasting task of patrolling the Atlantic off the coast of Africa in order to prevent slave ships of various nationalities from continuing to supply slaves illegally.
Again, more facts that are rarely heard. The British patrolled the coast of Africa in order to prevent slaves from continuing to be sold. It's crazy. It's unfortunate that we're in a time where you have to search out these things, and this information isn't so readily available. It's very unfortunate, but here we are, and you got to do what you got to do. Oh, by the way, the YouTube channel I'm on is Sowell Explains. Sowell Explains. Excellent channel, by the way. All right, let's go.
Even during the Napoleonic Wars, Britain continued to keep some of its warships on patrol off West Africa. Moreover, such patrols likewise tried to interdict the shipments of slaves from East Africa through the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf. Brazil capitulated to British demands that it end its slave trade after being publicly humiliated by British warships that seized and destroyed slave ships within Brazil's own waters. In 1873, 2 British cruisers appeared off the coast of Zanzibar and threatened to blockade the island unless the slave market there shut down. It was shut down.
Wow.
It would be hard to think of any other crusade pursued so relentlessly for so long by any nation at such mounting costs without any economic or other tangible benefit to itself. These costs included bribes paid to Spain and Portugal to get their cooperation with the effort to stop the international slave trade, and the costs of maintaining naval patrols and of resettling freed slaves, not to mention dangerous frictions with France and the United States, among other countries. Captains of British warships who detained vessels suspected of carrying slaves were legally liable if those vessels turned out to have no slaves on board. The human costs were also large. The heavy drain, physical and mental, in keeping squadrons on the East African coast was reflected in the loss of 282 officers and men in the 10 years 1875 to 1885. And this did not include those invalidated home. Naval personnel, racked by fever, sunstroke, and dysentery, were forced to retire prematurely and live on a small pittance. The cost of upkeep of the squadron over the 20 years prior to 1890 was estimated at 4 million sterling, and this did not take into account the large amount of work imposed on consular and judicial staff at Zanzibar in trying cases and dealing with reports, etc. Even so, the results were slow in coming. More streamlined slave ships were designed in hopes of being able to outrun the ships of the Royal Navy in the Atlantic. Nevertheless, the dogged persistence of the British eventually reduced the shipment of slaves across the Atlantic and across the waters of the Islamic world.
Now, I've heard some people try to explain, so to speak, or understand why the West went through such pains in order to end slavery. And here, Thomas Sowell points out how there was really no financial benefit for doing this. They had to pay money sometimes in order to try to minimize any risk or the dangers of fighting or any problems like that. And even they did this even at the loss of their own life. In my mind, unless somebody could point me to some other information, it has to be someone who has a true conviction that this is wrong, that slavery was just a moral wrong, a utter failure of mankind, and for someone to be willing to put themselves at such risk for no financial gain. You have to truly be passionate about the topic that you're fighting for, what you're trying to stop, what you're trying to end. Hey, what's up, Edwin? Appreciate you, brother. Thanks for stopping by.
Although the French flag was for many years widely used as protection from the boarding of ships on the high seas by the British Navy, even by slave traders who were neither French nor authorized to fly the French flag. Eventually, France itself turned against slavery, outlawed the institution, and sent some of its own warships to patrol the Atlantic off the coast of Africa to intercept and deter the shipment of slaves to the Western Hemisphere. The American flag was likewise so used, and the United States, like France, eventually turned against the slave trade and sent warships to join the Atlantic patrols to interdict slave shipments. Although by 1860, the Atlantic slave trade had been effectively stopped, the slave trade from East Africa across the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf took longer to be reduced significantly. Off the east coast of Africa, smaller Arab vessels called dhows hugged the coastlines in waters too shallow for the British warships to enter. One British commodore estimated that he captured one dhow for every 8 that escaped. Nevertheless, during the period from 1866 to 1869, 129 slave vessels were captured and 3,380 slaves were freed. When the threat of being boarded seemed imminent, the Arabs would throw slaves overboard to drown, rather than have them be found on board, which could lead to British seizure of the vessel and punishment of those who manned it.
Man, that's just evil. In order not to get caught, you'd rather kill these men, these women, children, instead of having to pay the price for your crimes. Crazy.
The worst that could befall the slaves was when the slaver was overhauled by a British cruiser, and they might then be flung overboard to dispose of all evidence. Devereux mentions a case where the Arabs, when pursued by an English cruiser, cut the throats of 24 slaves and threw them overboard.
My goodness.
Colomb also states that Arabs would not hesitate to knock slaves on the head and throw them overboard to avoid capture. Because there were only a few naval ships available to cover a vast expanse of water in this region, British warships would often launch smaller boats to engage the Arab slave dhows. In these cases, as one study put it, the slave traffickers frequently did not hesitate to attack boat crews in defense of their profits. Battles between the Arabs' vessels and the smaller British craft were especially likely when the larger ships that launched them were too far away to reach the scene in time to join the battle. In other cases, the Arabs fled even from the smaller British vessels. An episode in 1866 was typical. On 26 April 1866, the Penguin set out after a dhow and fired several shots in an effort to make the crew come to. When the dhow failed to lower its sail, Gartorth felt certain that she was a slaver and ceased firing for the sake of the slaves on board. However, he managed to close with the dhow, which then made for the rocks through a heavy surf. By the time the ship's boats could be lowered to follow, the Arab crew had fled, but the pounding surf made any attempt by the slavers to salvage the human cargo too dangerous. To their horror, the boat crew found that they too could not reach the dhow, which was rapidly filling with water, drowning the slaves. The boat officer decided that he could not risk coming in close to the dhow, but several of the crewmen of the cutter recklessly dived in and swam through the surf to the dhow. In a remarkable display of courage, the sailors managed to bring 28 of the slaves back to the boat. But the dhow appeared to have had more than 200 slaves on board, and most died in the pounding waves.
Now, totally evil, Rosalind. And James, this it's just evil. And I mean, it's just really sad. But imagine if this curriculum, a curriculum that included this information, was included in what you learned in the public school system. Just imagine how the hearts and minds of a nation would change. I think in a short period of time, instead of all this social justice and CRT and wokeness that's overtaken our nation, overtaken the world to some degree, when people see the compassion and the ultimate sacrifice that some men and women were willing to take for a fellow image bearer, man, I mean, you can't help but be moved by that. Just hearing that moves me. Men diving into the sea trying to save people, putting themselves at risk. No greater love has no one done this, and he laid down his life for his friend. So profound, so true.
Another episode, the Arabs' ruthlessness toward the slaves was further revealed. When the Daphne's cutter captured a dhow with 156 slaves on board, many were found to be in the final stages of starvation and dysentery. One woman was brought out of the dhow with a month-old infant in her arms. The baby's forehead was crushed, and when she was asked how the injury had happened, she explained to the ship's interpreter that as the boat came alongside, the baby began to cry. One of the dowmen, fearing that the sailors would hear the cries, picked up a stone and crushed the child's head. This was not a unique act. British missionary and explorer David Livingstone related a similar incident on land. One woman, who was unable to carry both her load and young child, had the child taken from her and saw its brains dashed out on a stone. Dr. Livingstone also reported having nightmares for weeks after encountering Arab slave traders and their victims.
Barbaric.
Not only was this Christian missionary shocked by the brutality of the Arab slave traders, so was Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt, who was a battle-hardened military commander. None of this means that the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade should be ignored, downplayed, or excused, nor have they been. A vast literature has detailed the vile conditions under which slaves from Africa lived and died during their voyages to the Western Hemisphere. But the much less publicized slave trade to the Islamic countries had even higher mortality rates en route, as well as involving larger numbers of people over the centuries, even though the Atlantic slave trade had higher peaks while it lasted. By a variety of accounts, most of the slaves who were marched across the Sahara toward the Mediterranean died on the way. While these were mostly women and girls, the males faced a special danger: castration, to produce the eunuchs in demand as harem attendants in the Islamic world. Because castration was forbidden by Islamic law, the operation tended to be performed, usually crudely, in the hinterlands, before the slave caravans reached places within the effective control of the Ottoman Empire. The great majority of those operated on died as a result. But the price of eunuchs was so much higher than the price of other slaves that the practice was still profitable on net balance. The British Governor-General of the Sudan, C.G. Gordon, estimated that between 1875 and 1879, from 80,000 to 100,000 slaves were exported through his region. General Gordon imposed the death penalty on those convicted of castrating slave men to market them as eunuchs. His attempt to stamp out slave trading in the Sudan cost him his own life as an opposing army, raised and led by Muhammad Mahad, defeated his troops at Khartoum in 1885 and killed Gordon.
I mean, some of these things are so barbaric, I don't even want to listen to them, honestly. But I'm playing this because I know that this information needs to be out there. It needs to be heard. I'm hoping as time goes on, more people will find this. They'll discover my channel. They'll discover Sowell Explained. That's the channel where I'm getting this information, or all the other sources, all the other channels, people who are trying to put this information out there. So more of us, more people in general can know more about our world history. It isn't as simple as it has been portrayed for so many decades. There's so much more complexity to everything that went down during the slave trade. And as time goes on, if not today, but in part 3, we'll definitely get into more of those things. But let's continue.
After which, the slave trade flourished again. British control in the region was firmly re-established in 1898 by the crushing victory of troops led by Lord Kitchener at Omdurman, and including a young officer named Winston Churchill. On the issue of slavery, it was essentially Western civilization against the world.
I'm going to pause that. I want that to be seen on the screen. On the issue of slavery, it was essentially the Western civilization against the world. Arabs, Africans, Brazilians, etc., wanted the slave trade to continue. And the West fought valiantly, bravely, fiercely against that. Know your history, y'all. Know your history.
At the time, Western civilization had the power to prevail against all other civilizations. That is how and why slavery was destroyed as an institution in almost the whole world. But it did not happen all at once or even within a few decades. When the British finally stamped out slavery in Tanganyika in 1922, it was more than half a century after the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States, and vestiges of slavery still survived in parts of Africa into the 21st century.
It sure does.
The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners. Although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners. There were thousands of whites who were only nominal owners of members of their own families.
Play that again.
There were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts. An estimated 1/3 of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War.
My goodness. Like I said, I've listened to this audiobook multiple times, read the book multiple times, but every time I hear, there's some things that I don't recall hearing this. I mean, I know that there were thousands of blacks who were slaveholders. I'm aware of that. But fighting in the Civil War in order to maintain your quote unquote right, wow. About to move on to part 3, a few more seconds to go.
Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean. In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century. And outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense.
Whew. Yeah, we're not done yet, y'all. I'm just moving on to the next video. But while that video loads up, my goodness, I appreciate y'all commenting. What do you think about everything that we're learning so far? I got a few more minutes. I might do another 10, 15 minutes or so of content to discuss. Again, we're going to move on to the next section here, and I'll try to keep them pretty short and maintain a good 45 minutes per session tops. But what are your thoughts on everything that you're learning so far? If you're here, if you're watching this live, comment below. If you're seeing this later on, I'd love to hear your comments as well. I'll read them and I'll respond to them. But is this news to you or new to you?
If slavery is not morally wrong, it is hard to imagine what else could possibly be wrong. Yet when Lincoln expressed this view, which was gaining currency in his time, it was a belief less than a century old in the West and still virtually non-existent outside the West. In ancient times, Aristotle had attempted to justify slavery, but many other Western and non-Western philosophers alike took it so much for granted that they felt no need to explain or justify it at all. Some Muslims regarded attempts to abolish slavery as impious, since the Quran itself accepted slavery as an institution, while trying to ameliorate the lot of the slave. Only in the American South did a large apologetic literature develop, seeking to justify slavery, because only there was slavery under such large-scale and sustained attacks on moral grounds as to require a response. While slavery was referred to in antebellum America as a peculiar institution, in an international perspective and in the long view of history, it was not this institution that was peculiar, but the principles of American freedom, with which slavery was in such obvious and irreconcilable conflict. If all men were created equal, as the Declaration of Independence proclaimed, then the only way to justify slavery was by depicting those enslaved as not fully men. A particularly virulent form of racism thus arose from a particularly desperate need to defend slavery against telling attacks that invoked the fundamental principles of the American Republic.
I've found over the years, as I've studied the history of the slave trade, that there are striking similarities between the arguments that the slave holders used in order to defend this vile evil that the quote unquote pro-choice advocates use, an attempt to dehumanize the human that is being discussed. Not much difference at all.
Nowhere else in the world was slavery in such dire straits ideologically, and nowhere else did racism reach such heights, or depths, in defense of the institution. As a noted study of Brazil observed, the defenders of slavery on clearly racist grounds were as rare among public supporters of slavery in Brazil as they were common in the United States. Brazil was not a democracy, and so had no such ideological contradictions to overcome. In short, racism was neither necessary nor sufficient for slavery, whose origins antedated racism by centuries. Racism was a result, not a cause, of slavery, and not all societies that enslaved people of another race became pervaded with racism to the extent that the American South did. The stark contrast between the slave and the free, which made slavery a moral issue in the Western world in modern times, was simply not there for most societies and for most of history in most of the world. In hierarchical societies, where people were born into their stations in life, ranging through many gradations from royalty to bondage, slavery was simply the bottom rung on a ladder based on the accident of birth, one notch below the serf, who was bought and sold with the land, instead of individually. This is not to say that being a slave was a matter of indifference. A horror of becoming a slave has been widespread around the world, but this is wholly different from a reluctance to enslave others. Christians, Muslims, and Jews all forbade the enslavement of their own respective fellow religionists, though they did not always honor even this ban, but all considered it permissible to enslave others. Clergy themselves had slaves, and both Christian monasteries in Europe and Buddhist monasteries in Asia owned slaves.
So at one point, there were times in our history where everyone was culpable. There's no denial of that. And I love the clarity he brings to the issue. He doesn't just frame it to where it's not the white man's fault, but everyone, of course, white folks played a role, just like Africans played a role. Christians, Muslims, your quote unquote intellectuals from the early first century and before and after, everyone at some point or another was culpable in the slave trade that we've come to know in over the last few hundred years and throughout world history. But we can point in scripture how man stealing is wrong. There's a definite precedence for that. There's a definite precedence for taking a prisoner of war in the Bible, especially in the Old Covenant. But we have to always remember that who were the ones who were primarily behind the ending of slavery here in the United States and worldwide. In England, you have people like William Wilberforce and other abolitionists across the globe, in particularly, again, in the West, who were against slavery and who were the main engines driving the abolitionist movement.
Even Sir Thomas More's fictional ideal society, Utopia, had slavery. It was not until the late 18th century that there was even an intellectual movement, much less a political movement, for the abolition of slavery, and those in these movements were distinctly in the minority, even in the West, and had no counterparts outside the West.
Mm.
What was historically unusual was the emergence in the late 18th century of a strong moral sense that slavery was so wrong that Christians could not in good conscience enslave anyone or countenance the continuation of this institution among themselves or others. Nor was this view confined to religious leaders or congregations. Adam Smith in Britain and Montesquieu in France were among the secular intellectuals who wrote against slavery in the 18th century. Slavery was one of a number of long-standing institutions and traditions which were being questioned in the 18th century in the West. Before then, both secular and religious philosophers going back to Plato had seen the mundane physical world as being far less important than the ideal or spiritual world, so that being right and free in one's mind was more important than one's fate in the physical world. Dissipating one's energies trying to reform the practices of a sinful world was considered less important than bringing one's own soul into line with spiritual imperatives. To the religious, the world of the here and now was a transient thing, a prelude and a testing ground for the world that really mattered, the world of eternity. However, as a humanistic philosophy began to affect both secular and religious thought, what happened in the mundane physical world began to assume greater importance than it had before in the eyes of intellectuals, philosophers, and religious leaders. As the fate of human beings in the here and now loomed larger as a moral concern, the fate of slaves became part of the intellectual and moral agenda of the times.
And if we look at it biblically, we understand this world, what happens here in this world matters. It's not as if you can do whatever you want as long as you focus on the next life. We are called to love our neighbors as ourselves, love our enemies, to love our wives. Men are called to love their wives as Christ loved the church. Our actions are important. How we live on this earth is important. And I wouldn't be surprised if people saw how poorly a lot of these slaves were treated. They looked up in Bible history when you see how God freed the Jews. And man, you can't help but be moved and see that enslaving people, oppressing people is ungodly. It is unbiblical. And I'm confident that played a pretty large role.
Over the centuries, established religious institutions in the West, notably the Catholic Church, but later including also established Protestant denominations, had made their peace with the institution of slavery as a fact of life and produced traditional rationales to reconcile it with the message of Christianity. Now these institutions, traditions, and rationales came under fire from within, as well as outside, the religious community across a broad front, of which slavery was just one battleground. Religious minorities, such as the Quakers or the evangelicals within the Anglican Church, could not simply rely on religious tradition and authority because their very existence was based on a questioning of, and in some cases a break with, those traditions and authorities. These insurgents had to think independently about slavery, as about other things, and derive their own conclusions, as most people do not have to think through things which have been accepted facts of life for centuries. The rising class of secular intellectuals in the West could even less rely on the authority of established religious institutions. This did not mean that either secular or religious insurgents were automatically anti-slavery. What it meant was that they both had to evolve some intellectually and morally defensible position because they could not simply base themselves on existing beliefs or practices. Different individuals resolved the issues differently. But out of this process came some who began to see slavery as an intolerable evil.
So much good stuff there, y'all. Again, what are your thoughts on this? Especially if this is new to you. What are your thoughts? Comment down below, comment in the chat. I'd love to know your thoughts. I'm going to wrap it up here, y'all. I appreciate you jumping in. Stay tuned. And over the next 2 days or so, I will be going back live and going over part 3. We'll continue where we left off. Not sure how long this is going to go. Again, if you support and appreciate my content, make sure you share it. If you haven't liked and subscribed yet, what are you waiting on? Jump on it. Give me a like and subscribe. We're trying to get this information to more people. Please share my content if you would be so kind. Help me get monetized so that I can better fund what it is I'm trying to do here. I'm really trying to expand and make sure that this information goes out to more people. But again, as always, I appreciate y'all being here, and I'll see you on the next one. God bless.